Okay, let's get into the Lichtman Live for today, which is tariffs. Go ahead, Dad.
Which is very important because that is front and center in what Trump has promised to do once he's in office. It's maybe his most important economic policy, along with the promise of big tax cuts. So I'm going to give you a quote about tariffs. Up go the prices now. How the tariff taxes the necessities of life. Merchants are marking up almost everything that we wear, eat, or keep house with. Do you know who said that and when?
Obviously, yes. That was Teddy Roosevelt in 1919.
Not too far off.
Oh, okay.
Actually, good. New
Okay.
York Times, 1890,
Oh,
acting to the new so-called McKinley tariff. The
oh.
McKinley tariff brokered by future President William McKinley that substantially raised tariff rates in order to protect the Republicans' business clients from foreign competition. And of course, the result was to raise prices across the board. This led to accusations that the Congress was the $1 million Congress back in the day when $1 million actually meant something. Today, we're talking about the $1 billion Congress or the $400 billion guy who seems to have undue influence over the Congress. But even back then, it was widely recognized that tariffs had this drag on the economy of raising prices because the foreign governments don't pay the cost the American consumer does because the cost of the tariff is hiked on to the cost of goods and services that are imported into the United States. The $1 million Congress was so unpopular that in 1892, Democrats won control over both houses of Congress and the presidency. Do you know who the Democrat was in 1892, Sam?
Yes. Of
Of course
course
you
I
do.
do. It
Everybody does.
right. It
Grover
for
Cleveland.
Cleveland. Duh.
Yeah. And of course, Cleveland was not a modern Democrat. He was an old-fashioned states' rights, limited government, hard money, gold standard Democrat, and his policies contributed to the Great Depression of the 1890s, second only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. But you didn't get any reduction of tariffs until the election of the next Democratic president. Only two Democrats were elected between the Civil War and 1912. Grover Cleveland was one of them, and the other was the Democrat elected in 1912. You know who that was?
Yes.
Froggy's
The
going to twang you.
the Democrat elected in 1912.
Yes,
That
very
was
famous.
that was Teddy Roosevelt.
He was a Republican, but that's close. Woodrow Wilson.
Oops.
You've heard of him, right?
Yes.
And what was the first thing he did? He went to Congress, made a speech devoted to one issue. You know what that was? You can probably guess.
Tariffs.
Tariffs. Big
Yay.
time tariff reduction, which helped bring prices down and helped the economy. And then when Republicans came back into power, they raised the tariffs again. But that was kind of masked during the prosperity of the 1920s until we had the stock market crash of 1929 and the beginnings of an economic downturn. And how did the Republicans in Congress and President Herbert Hoover respond to these early signs of a major economic downturn? What did they enact in 1930?
Tariffs.
The Smoot-Hawley tariff, which on average raised goods that were subject to tariffs by 40 to 60%. This was not a minor increase and greatly expanded the number of goods and services subject to tariffs. You think this had a good effect on the economy, Sam?
No.
No, of course not. It created an international trade war in which both imports and exports, important parts of the economy, sank by more than 60%. International trade flows were clogged. It contributed to not the beginning, it wasn't the cause of the depression, but it certainly deepened and probably lengthened the depression. At the time of the tariffs, unemployment was 8%. A couple, 3 years later, at the bottom of the Great Depression, it was nearly 25%, just an enormous descent of their economy. A quarter to a third of the standard of living, goods and services produced by the economy, were lost after the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Here's a famous quote about it.
The Smoot-Hawley tariff ignited an international trade war and helped sink our country into the Great Depression.
Was that some big liberal like Lyndon Johnson, Sam?
Of course not.
It was Ronald Reagan
I
in
knew that.
1986. You knew that.
I knew that, of course.
You knew that. Now, of course, Donald Trump, both in his first term and currently, is reviving the spirit of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. In his first term, he imposed tariffs on products worth about $380 billion, according to the Tax Foundation. And Biden wasn't much better. He kept in place most of the Trump tariffs, which, according to the Tax Foundation, cost the average U.S. household $625 per year. You know, not a lot for Elon Musk, but, you know, a hit for someone who is living paycheck to paycheck. It also cost 142,000 jobs and reduced real GDP by 0.2%. Small numbers, but very significant, you know, for the economy. But now we know Trump is proposing vastly greater tariff increases than he did during his first term, really very much modeling himself with the severity of what he's proposed. We don't know what's ultimately going to happen. We can only know at this point, since he's not in office, what he has proposed. But the Tax Foundation estimates that the effect of these taxes, as bad as the first set of, I keep calling them taxes, because they really are, they're like a tax on the average American, the effects of these tariffs would be vastly greater than that of the first round of tariffs in Trump's first term. That likely it would impose costs on the average U.S. household well in excess of $1,000 per year. That is a big hit for people on a tight budget living paycheck to paycheck. And that does not count all of the ripple effects. That's just the tariffs themselves. Doesn't even count what's going to happen to our economy from the effects of retaliation of starting a global trade war, which, you know, very well could happen if Trump goes through with these draconian kinds of tariffs. What happened in Smoot-Hawley was, of course, other nations retaliated when the U.S. hiked its tariffs to such a substantial degree. You got an international trade war. You clogged the international economy, and it contributed to the misery of the Great Depression. Didn't cause it, and it wasn't the sole thing responsible for the decline of the economy, but was certainly a contributor. And so those costs, you know, over $1,000 per household, do not, the Tax Foundation stresses, take into account all of the ripple effects if we really do get an international trade war like we had after the adoption of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. What's also so interesting about this is if you look at professions of Republican philosophy, Mike Johnson had 7 core principles of conservatism. The Heritage Foundation had a set of principles called the True North of conservatism. and prominent. Right up there as one of their most important principles was free enterprise, a commitment to a free market economy. Let the market operate free of restraint. Let the market efficiently allocate goods and services. Let the market keep prices down and wages high. Let the market enable people to succeed by their own merits, their own hard work, their own values, their own ideas. The magic of the market, the free market, absolutely front and center of Republican and conservative ideology. And yet, there is perhaps little more you could do to throttle free markets than impose draconian tariffs, which undermine free markets here at home because you don't have the market determining prices and destroys free markets, the flow of free goods and services across international borders. This, of course, isn't the only thing that Republicans and conservatives have done to promote their view of enterprise, not free markets, to promote private enterprise. You know, back in the 20s, they passed the Radio Act, which regulated the airwaves to squeeze out the small competitors and benefit the big corporations. They signed on to legislation to keep oil prices high and to give special tax breaks to the big oil companies. And of course, they have supported all kinds of subsidies and loan guarantee to business. And then later on, under George W. Bush, of course, they passed legislation insulating the gun manufacturers from any kind of lawsuits. And so, you know, not only are tariffs bad for the economy, bad for the world, they're also fundamentally contradictory to the free market ideology that folks like Mike Johnson and Mike Pence and Donald Trump are selling to us.
Wow, that was interesting. Thanks, Dad.